Hey guys, I'm back to officially finish Lincoln's Grave Robbers. We are reading the epilogue today, which we know comes at the very end of the story. And a lot of times, the story has ended, so the epilogue just explains what's happened afterwards. This is titled Final Resting Place, and it's a question. 6 months later, John Carroll Power was still waiting for directions from his bosses about what to do with Lincoln's coffin. It was still sitting there on the damp labyrinth floor. In the summer of 1877, workers came to renovate one of the monument's walls. That meant going into the labyrinth, and Power realized that workmen would certainly notice the coffin. Instead of having them stumble upon it, he decided to tell them it was there, and who was in it. Less than 2 days later, Power overheard people in Springfield swapping the latest rumor. Lincoln's body was sitting in the dirt under a stack of rotting lumber. Horrified, Power rushed to John Stewart of the Monument Association to discuss the crisis. Stewart was no help, and the other elderly association members just couldn't face going back into that suffocating space and hauling that heavy coffin again, especially not in summer. All Power could do was hope the rumors would die down. Patrick Tyrrell traveled to Joliet on May 22, 1878, the day Jack Hughes and Terrence Mullen were due to get out of prison. While at the state pen, Tyrrell stopped in to see Ben Boyd. In the 2.5 years since Boyd's arrest, he and Tyrrell had become friendly. Boyd even offered his former nemesis occasional advice on catching Coney men. Tyrrell then waited outside the main door of the prison at 1 p.m. when Hughes walked out a free man, or so he thought. But Tyrrell grabbed his arm and slapped handcuffs on his wrists. "I informed Jack that there was another case against him," Tyrrell reported, "that he would have to come to Chicago." Hughes was still facing charges for passing fake money. Remember, he'd been a wanted man even before the Lincoln job disaster. Now, Tyrrell hauled him to Chicago and a judge sent him right back to the Illinois State Penitentiary. This time, for 3 years of hard labor. Mullen, meanwhile, returned to Chicago only to find that while he was in jail, Big Jim Kennelly had sold the hub and disappeared with the money. So really, neither one of them won. Shortly after midnight on November 7, 1878, a gang of body snatchers snuck into a gated cemetery in New York City and pried up the stone slab above the burial vault of a wealthy merchant named Alexander Stewart. The men climbed down into the vault, cracked open Stewart's casket, shoved the rotting body into a bag, and hurried off. The gang contacted Stewart's family and demanded a $250,000 ransom for the dead man's remains. The story was huge news around the country and soon showed up in the Springfield papers, reminding everyone of the attempt to steal Lincoln. "It appeared to me," Power recalled, "as though half the people of Springfield accosted me on the street or came to the monument and inquired if the body of Lincoln was safe. I did not think it was, but evaded their questions as well as I could." Again, Powers begged members of the Monument Association for help. Again, they said they were too old, the casket was too heavy, it was too hot down there. Power was done waiting. Acting on his own, he recruited 5 trustworthy young men. When they met him at the monument on the night of November 18th, Power handed out shovels and lanterns and led the way through Monument Hall into the labyrinth. They dug a hole and placed Lincoln's coffin at the bottom. 3 nights later, Power was finally beginning to relax when he got another shock. He was home after work, going through his mail, and came to a strange postcard. The short message read, "Be careful. Do not be alone, particularly Thursday night, November 21st. The note was signed with only the letter C. It had been sent from Chicago. Panic swept over Power again. It was the night of November 21st. He thought about rushing back to the monument, but it was too late, and he was scared to go alone. "Little sleep came to my eyes that night," he said. Early next morning, he hurried into the labyrinth. There were no footsteps, no signs anyone had tried to break in. All was safe, he reported. Who sent the postcard? What did it mean? Power never found out, and the mystery haunted him. Is there real danger? He wondered. Is there another scheme to capture the remains of Lincoln, or is someone trying to play a joke? Unable to face this fear alone, Power talked to the men who had helped him bury Lincoln's coffin. Together, they agreed to form a secret organization with just one mission: protect Lincoln's body. They called themselves the Lincoln Guard of Honor. We were never bound by any oath, Power said of the Guard, but something much stronger, our own sense of honor. And here is the Lincoln Guard of Honor. Just a bunch of men. In March 1880, Terrence Mullen was arrested for passing counterfeit bills in St. Louis. Tyrrell rushed to the jail, eager to talk with the Coney man. Just as he'd hoped, Mullen was furious with Big Jim Kennelly and agreed to talk. Acting on Mullen's information, Secret Service agents caught Kennelly with a stash of bogus $10 bills in his possession. A judge gave him 2 years in prison. Louis Sveggles may have helped save Lincoln's body, but he just couldn't stay clean. In one of his daily reports from 1880, Tyrrell mentioned that Sveggles was back behind bars, doing 12 years in Joliet for burglary. What about Boyd's brother-in-law, Pete McCartney, the Coney man who prided himself on wriggling out of any trap? His luck ran out too. McCartney was nabbed in Indiana shoving fake 20s. He tried to bribe the cops with $1,500 in real money, but they hauled him off to jail. At trial, McCartney promised to change his ways, but the judge wasn't buying it. "There's little hope to reform," the judge told McCartney. "It is my duty to sentence you to 15 years at hard labor in the state prison." This time, McCartney served every day of his sentence. Mary Lincoln died on July 16, 1882. Her coffin was placed in the catacomb at the Lincoln Monument next to the marble sarcophagus that everyone assumed held Abraham Lincoln's remains. Robert Lincoln knew the box was empty and knew his mother wanted to be buried beside her husband. So, late one night, Power and the other members of the Lincoln Guard of Honor carried Mary into the labyrinth, dug a hole, and set her down next to Abe. "I cannot adequately thank you," Robert wrote to the guard. "I think it will be best that no change should be made for a long time to come." But the story wasn't over. The rumors never faded. People continued whispering that Lincoln wasn't actually in his marble sarcophagus. Almost every day, Power faced the same question from tourists. Was the body in the box, or wasn't it? "We put it back there the second day after the attempt to steal it," Powers always said, and that was strictly true. He just didn't mention that they'd taken it back out again. When people pestered him for details, Powers would say, "I suppose you wish to know if there is not further danger. If so, I can assure you that it is absolutely safe." If they asked more questions about the body, Power cut them off. And that was the end of the discussion. Power refused to say more. He insisted that the body was safe, and he knew in his heart it wasn't. Nothing but door locks and a few inches of dirt stood between Lincoln and a new team of body snatchers. After several more years of pleading with the Monument Association, Power finally convinced the members it was time for a permanent solution. Workers pulled up the tiles of the catacomb floor and dug a deep hole. On the morning of April 14, 1887, members of the Monument Association and Guard of Honor gathered at the monument. A Springfield plumber named Leon Hopkins was there too, though he didn't know why he'd been asked to come. "I guess we might as well get to work," Power said. The men carried the two bodies out of the labyrinth and set them down in Memorial Hall. Before they placed the coffins in the new hole, there was one last piece of business. Crazy rumors about the true whereabouts of Lincoln's remains had to be put to rest once and for all. After so many changes, Power explained, it was indispensably necessary to identify the body of the president. The lid of Lincoln's wooden coffin was lifted. Then Leon Hopkins found out why he was there. He was called forward and told to carefully cut open the inner lead coffin. Hopkins did this, gently bending back a flap of the soft metal above Lincoln's head. Sunlight slanted through the open door into the coffin. Everyone pushed forward to look. Of the 18 or 19 persons present, nearly all had personally seen the president in life, Power reported. There was not one who expressed the slightest doubt that he was looking at the features of the beloved president. The remains were somewhat shrunken, added the Monument Association members in a signed document, but the features were quite natural, and we could readily recognize them as the features of the former illustrious president of our nation, and our former friend and fellow citizen. Hopkins then bent the lead back into place and soldered the seams to make them airtight. The two coffins were carried around the monument to the catacomb and lowered into the new hole. Then workers poured in 4 feet of concrete, and when it hardened, laid the marble tiles back down just as they had been before. A very relieved Power could finally report that Lincoln's body was safe. And then there's a photo here of Lincoln's coffin being hoisted out of the ground. So when they dug it out of the ground to put it back in the catacomb. After serving his 10 years, Ben Boyd was released from prison and went back to work as an engraver, this time doing perfectly legal work at a factory. He has squared it, reported the Chicago Tribune. He is a living personification of what a man can do if he will to regain a footing in society and make an honest living. Secret Service Chief James Brooks was impressed. Boyd took his medicine manfully and never whimpered. John Carroll Powers stayed on as custodian at the Lincoln Monument. In his spare time, he wrote history of an attempt to steal the body of Abraham Lincoln. In the first book about this story, and the only one by an eyewitness. He died in 1894 at age 74 and was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery, very close to the monument he guarded for 20 years. Patrick Tyrrell served in the Secret Service until his retirement in 1899. Nothing is known about how he spent the next 21 years, but he lived until 1920. He died at age 89 and was buried in Chicago. Incredibly, Abraham Lincoln's body was not done moving. By 1900, the poorly built Lincoln Monument was starting to collapse. Before the foundation could be rebuilt, the bodies of Lincoln and his family had to be safely removed. Workers first carried out the coffins of Lincoln's 3 sons. Then they cracked through the concrete above Abraham and Mary's coffins. All 5 bodies were locked in a temporary vault near the monument until the renovations were complete. In April 1901, they were returned to the catacomb. Mary and the boys were sealed in crypts in the catacomb wall. Abraham was placed back into the white marble sarcophagus that had held his body at the time of the robbery. Robert Lincoln came to take a look. He couldn't believe his eyes. After everything that had happened, his father's body was sitting there, above ground, exactly where it had been in 1876. And then here is it's a photo of the 5 Lincoln coffins being reburied in 1901. So there's that photo. He ordered a new hole dug in the catacomb. He wanted it 10 feet deep, and he wanted a steel cage set inside. On September 26, 1901, surviving members of the Guard of Honor gathered to move Lincoln's casket one last time. As soon as they got there, the men began to argue. Should they have one last look in the coffin just to make absolutely sure Lincoln was still in there? Robert had specifically told them not to open the casket. They decided to anyway. Once again, they sent for Leon Hopkins, the plumber. An honor guard member named Joseph Lindley also telephoned the school of his 13-year-old son, Fleetwood, and talked with Fleetwood's teacher. The teacher told Fleetwood to race out to the Lincoln Monument right away. The boy wasn't sure what the hurry was about, but he hopped on his bicycle, sped to the monument, pedaled up to Memorial Hall, pushed his bike inside, and leaned it against the wall. Someone shut the door behind Fleetwood. The room darkened. A single electric lamp threw a pool of light on a casket, which rested on 2 sawhorses. People stopped talking as Leon Hopkins stepped forward with a blowtorch. He began cutting open the lead just as he had done 14 years before. Fleetwood crowded in for a closer look. He had only seen Lincoln in photographs, but when the casket was opened, he recognized the famous man immediately. His face was chalky white, Fleetwood would never forget. His clothes were mildewed. He looked just like the statue of himself lying there, said another eyewitness. Everyone agreed. This was Abraham Lincoln. Hopkins pushed the lead flap back into place. I watched the shadow of the lid fall across Lincoln's face, recalled Guard of Honor member B.H. Monroe. That face disappeared from mortal view forever. Fleetwood lifted one of the leather straps attached to the coffin and helped lower Lincoln's body into the steel cage. Sitting inside the 10-foot hole in the catacomb floor, the cage was locked, and workers then began pouring in tons of wet concrete. As the concrete slowly dried, the body of Abraham Lincoln was sealed inside a massive, rock-hard block. It's still there. So they never moved it again after that, but lordy, it took them forever to get it there. Okay, so there is actually an extension to this book, and it's called Body Snatcher Bonus Section. So I will read that tomorrow, and then we will start our new book on Monday. Bye, guys. Have a good evening.